Open the damn door! The banging on my front door was so loud I swore the hinges rattled. I already knew who it was. Taking a deep breath, I wiped the grease off my hands with an old rag, tossed it on the workbench, and made my way toward the door, rolling my shoulders as I walked. This wasn't going to be a friendly chat. I pulled open the door, and there she was. Mrs. Grayson, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, standing on my porch like she was about to personally evict me from my own damn house. Her carefully styled blonde bob was frizzed from anger, her pearl necklace tight around her throat, and her manicured hand was still frozen mid-air from pounding on my door like she was the fucking police. "You've got some nerve, Daniels," she spat. "This is the third time this week you've woken up half the goddamn neighborhood with that." She gestured toward my garage like it was a crack house instead of a car workshop, abomination of a project. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "Good afternoon to you too, Mrs. Grayson. Something I can help you with?" "Don't get fucking smart with me," she snapped. "You know what this is about? That disgusting engine noise has been rattling through the whole neighborhood. People have babies here. People work from home. But no, you just have to do your little whatever the fuck you're doing in there like this is some kind of," she scoffed, eyes narrowing, "fucking ghetto drag race." And there it was. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. "Care to repeat that?" I asked, my voice steady. She lifted her chin, hands on her hips. "I said, this isn't some trashy street corner where people rev their engines like animals. This is a respectable community, Daniels. Respectable people live here, and we're all sick of your bullshit." I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing it. Instead, I smiled. Slow and deliberate. That's interesting," I said, "because I heard teenagers blasting music at 2 a.m. last night. Didn't see you banging on their doors." She let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Don't you dare compare this to that." "Why not?" I raised an eyebrow. "The noise is noise, right? Or does it just bother you more when it's coming from me?" Her eyes flashed, her mouth opening, then snapping shut. She knew exactly what I was saying. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I don't care where you came from, Daniels. I really don't. But people here, we have standards. And we talk. And trust me, they're talking about you." I tilted my head. "Is that right?" "Oh yes," she continued, a smug smirk curling her lips. "We've all been discussing the issue, the problem." She let the words hang in the air like poisoned bait, waiting for me to snap. "You might think you belong here, but we know better." I felt the anger coil in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't my first time dealing with someone like her. "So let me get this straight," I said, voice smooth as glass. "You've been holding neighborhood meetings." "About me?" "HOA discussions," she corrected sharply. "And yes, you've been a topic. A nuisance. And yet you haven't cited Mr. Thompson's garage band, the kids with their dirt bikes, or the group of guys that play poker until 3 a.m., with their windows wide open?" She rolled her eyes. "Those are different." "Different how?" She hesitated, just for a second, but that was enough. "You really don't want to do this, Daniels," she warned. "You can fight me all you want, but I guarantee you I will win." Ah, there it was, the real threat. I smiled wider. "See, the thing is, Mrs. Grayson, I don't think you will." She squinted at me. "Excuse me?" "I read the HOA guidelines," I said, slow and deliberate, like I was explaining it to a child. "Nowhere in there does it say I can't work on my car in my own garage during legal noise ordinance hours." She scoffed. "Rules are just guidelines, Daniels. The board can make your life very difficult." I chuckled, stepping back into my house. "I'm sure you'll try." She opened her mouth to say something else, but I was already shutting the door, and as the lock clicked into place, I let out a slow, satisfied exhale. She had no idea that the real reason I was working on my car wasn't for fun. No idea that I was preparing it for a charity race for kids with cancer. No idea that she had just picked a fight she couldn't win. And the best part? She was about to find out the hard way. The next morning I stepped outside to grab my mail, and there it was. An official HOA complaint notice taped to my front door like a scarlet letter. Notice of violation, mechanical noise, immediate compliance required. I snatched it off the door, shaking my head. That didn't take long. As I walked back inside, I spotted Mrs. Grayson across the street, standing in her driveway, arms crossed, watching me like a vulture, her lips curled into a smug little smirk, the kind of expression that said, "Checkmate, asshole." I smiled and gave her a casual wave. She stiffened. Yeah, she wasn't expecting that. I shut the door behind me, exhaling sharply. So this was how she wanted to play it. Petty complaints, passive-aggressive power moves. Fine. I grabbed my phone, took a picture of the notice, and added it to my growing Grayson fuckery file. I wasn't going to roll over, not for her, not for anyone. But I knew one thing. This was just the beginning. The next week, the complaints kept rolling in. A second violation, then a third. Failure to maintain community standards. Unauthorized auto work in a residential space. Obstruction of community aesthetic values. The last one made me laugh. Community aesthetic values? Bitch, it's a fucking garage. One morning I found my garbage cans mysteriously tipped over, trash strewn across my lawn like some raccoon mob had gone on a bender. Coincidence? But then, my water bill suddenly tripled. Then, a notice from the city appeared, informing me that someone had reported unlicensed auto repair services being run from my property. I felt my grip tighten around the paper, my jaw clenching so hard I thought my teeth might crack. Mrs. Grayson was stepping up her game. She wasn't just sending letters, she was weaponizing the system against me. That night I stood in my garage, hands braced against the workbench, staring at my car. This wasn't just about me anymore. I was fixing this car for something bigger, and no entitled, power-hungry HOA president was going to stop me. That's when I started digging. I spent the next few nights combing through every single HOA record I could find, and I started seeing the pattern. Mrs. Grayson had a history of targeting homeowners she didn't like. An older Latino couple had received repeated landscaping violations until they sold their home. A single mother was fined for excessive yard clutter when her kid left a bicycle outside for a day, and now, it was me. I made a list of everyone who had mysteriously moved out after dealing with her, and then I found something even better. Mrs. Grayson herself? She had violated HOA rules. I found photos of her hosting large parties, dozens of cars parked along the street, violating the same community standards she was shoving down my throat. She thought she was untouchable. She had no fucking idea what was coming next. The next morning, just as I was about to head into my garage, I heard it. The sound of heels clicking against pavement. I didn't even have to turn around. "Mr. Daniels?" Mrs. Grayson's voice rang out, syrupy sweet but laced with venom. "I see you haven't addressed the violations." I turned slowly, wiping my hands on my jeans, giving her my most unimpressed stare. "Mrs. Grayson," I greeted. "What a surprise. I was just about to get started on some compliance work." She smiled. "Good, because we've sent a final warning. If you don't adhere to the HOA's regulations immediately, we'll be escalating the matter to legal action." I let out a slow breath. "Legal action?" I repeated. "Over what exactly?" She handed me a folder, tapping it with her perfectly manicured nails. Multiple violations, persistent noise complaints, unauthorized mechanical work, obstructing community harmony. I flipped open the folder. It was laughable. The so-called complaints? Nothing but opinions and bullshit accusations. I chuckled, shaking my head. "Let me get this straight. You're willing to go to court over me fixing my car in my own garage?" Her smile didn't falter. "We take community standards very seriously." I stared at her for a long second, then leaned in slightly. "So do I." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She thought she was breaking me down. She had no idea I was already 3 steps ahead. A few days later, something strange happened. As I walked to my mailbox, a voice called out, "Hey, Daniels, right?" I turned to see Mrs. Patterson, a retired schoolteacher who lived 2 houses down. She glanced around before stepping closer. "I heard what they're trying to pull with you," she said, keeping her voice low. "It's bullshit." I raised an eyebrow. Grayson might materialize from thin air. "They did the same thing to the Lopez family," she murmured. "They kept getting fines until they couldn't take it anymore." I folded my arms. "And no one said anything?" She sighed. "That's how it is around here. You push back and they make your life hell." I took a deep breath, glancing around. Other neighbors were watching, some with curiosity, some with guilt, and some, a very select few, with anger. The cracks in Mrs. Grayson's empire were starting to show. The next day I got the final notice. This one was different. "Failure to comply will result in a formal HOA lawsuit and potential liens against your property." I stared at the letter, then set it down carefully on my workbench. That was it. They had just fucked up. I grabbed my phone and called my lawyer. "Hey, David," I said, voice calm. "It's time." He chuckled. "I was wondering when you'd say that." I grinned. Mrs. Grayson thought she had won. She thought she was about to crush me. She had no idea I was about to drop a nuclear bomb on her entire HOA kingdom. I barely had time to toss the latest bullshit violation notice into my growing pile before I heard the sound of heels clicking against pavement. "Mrs. Grayson?" "Right on fucking schedule." I didn't even have to look up. I already knew she was marching over like she had personally conquered the neighborhood and was about to demand my surrender. She didn't wait for me to greet her. "You're in serious trouble now, Daniels," she sneered, waving a folder in her perfectly manicured hand. "The board has officially decided to escalate your case. If you don't comply, we'll be pursuing a lawsuit, and trust me, we will win." Her voice had that same condescending sweetness as always, but this time she was pissed. I wasn't breaking. I took my time wiping my hands on my rag, leaning casually against my garage door. "Lawsuit?" I asked, feigning concern. "For what exactly? Owning a car? Working on my own property?" I snatched the folder from her hand and flipped through it. "Noise violations, unauthorized mechanical work, aesthetic disturbances." This was nothing but petty HOA bullshit. She smiled, that smug, arrogant smile she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. "You've been warned, Daniels. The next step is financial consequences. We'll slap fines on you so heavy you'll be begging to leave." She tilted her head, voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Or you could just do the right thing." I exhaled slowly, flipping the folder shut. "You know, Mrs. Grayson, I'd be worried if I didn't have a lawyer." I watched the flicker of panic flash across her face. "Oh, yeah." She wasn't expecting that. "And let me guess, you've been so busy harassing me, you didn't expect me to fight back." I grinned. "Well, sweetheart, you just fucked up." That night, I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood, just to see the temperature of the people living here. As I passed house after house, I could feel the eyes on me. Some were just curious, some were guilty, and some, those were the ones that interested me, some were angry. At her. Near the corner of the block, a voice called out, "Hey, Daniels, right?" I turned to see Mrs. Patterson, a retired teacher who had lived here for over 20 years. She looked nervous, glancing around like we were about to exchange classified information. I nodded. "That's me." She hesitated, then stepped closer. "Look," she said quietly, "I heard what they're doing to you. It's bullshit." I crossed my arms. "You're not the first person to say that." She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "They did the same thing to the Lopez family. They kept pushing fines, threats, violations, until they couldn't take it anymore. Sold their home and left." I clenched my jaw. "And no one said anything?" She exhaled sharply. "That's how it is here. You fight back and they make your life hell." I glanced up and down the street. Other neighbors were watching, some from their driveways, some from behind their curtains. This wasn't just my fight anymore. This was a fucking pattern. And Mrs. Grayson had no idea that she had just given me the best weapon against her. The more people she pushed, the more allies I gained. And when the time came, She wouldn't be able to silence us all. I gave Mrs. Patterson a nod. Appreciate the info. She hesitated. Are you going to leave? I laughed. Leave? I shook my head. Mrs. Grayson is about to learn what happens when you push the wrong man. The next morning the final notice arrived. This time, it wasn't just a letter taped to my door. This time, it was a certified HOA legal warning, stamped and hand-delivered by a board member who looked like he would have rather been anywhere else. I ripped it open and skimmed the first few lines. Failure to comply with HOA regulations will result in financial penalties, legal proceedings, and potential liens on your property. I let out a slow breath. There it was, the moment they crossed the line from annoying suburban dictatorship to full-scale legal harassment. And now? Now I had them. I grabbed my phone and dialed David, my lawyer. He picked up after one ring. Tell me you're finally ready to ruin these motherfuckers, he said. I smirked. David, I hope you've got your best suit ready, because it's time. He chuckled. I was wondering when you'd say that. Mrs. Grayson thought she had me cornered. She thought she was about to crush me. She had no fucking idea that she had just signed her own death warrant. This wasn't just about me and my car anymore. This was about every single person she had bullied, harassed, and pushed out. And when I was done, Mrs. Grayson wouldn't just be off the HOA board. She'd be begging to leave the neighborhood she once ruled. And that was a promise. The HOA meeting was packed, more than I expected. Neighbors who had never shown up before were standing against the walls, arms crossed, eyes flicking toward Mrs. Grayson at the head of the table. She sat with her perfect posture, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently against the desk. She thought this was her moment of victory. She had no idea she was about to lose everything. I walked in slow, deliberate, taking my time. I wanted her to feel it, the weight of her own downfall creeping up on her. As soon as I sat, she cleared her throat, plastering on that fake, tight-lipped smile. Mr. Daniels, she began, her voice dripping with forced patience. We've gathered today to address your repeated violations and discuss the legal proceedings moving forward. I leaned back in my chair, completely unfazed. Legal proceedings? I repeated, feigning curiosity. For what exactly? I pulled out every complaint notice she had sent me, stacking them neatly on the table. You mean these violations? The ones that have no legal basis, the ones that directly contradict your own HOA guidelines? The shift in the room was instant. Mrs. Grayson blinked, caught off guard. The board has every right to enforce. Oh, I agree, I cut in smoothly. But tell me, did the board also enforce these rules when Mr. Thompson's garage band played at 11 p.m.? Or when the Harris family threw massive block parties every month? Because I pulled HOA records. No complaints, not a single fine. But me? I tapped the stack of papers. This is targeted harassment. A murmur spread through the crowd. Mrs. Grayson's mask cracked, her eyes darting toward the other board members. But I wasn't done. I stood, pulling another folder from my bag. And let's talk about your violations, Mrs. Grayson. Because it turns out you're not as perfect as you pretend to be. The air went dead silent. I had her, and she knew it. The twist, I held up photographic evidence. Mrs. Grayson's backyard parties exceeding noise limits, unauthorized renovations that extended beyond HOA restrictions, and most damning of all, emails between her and certain board members discussing how to push out homeowners they didn't like. The color drained from her face. These are fabricated? She snapped. But her voice wavered. I turned, holding up my phone. Oh, really? I hit play on an audio recording. Her voice rang out loud and clear. Daniels is a problem. We need to make him want to leave. If we keep the pressure up, he'll either comply or he'll give up. Either way, we win. Gasps rippled through the room. Whispers, murmurs. The illusion of her authority shattered in real time. One of the board members, a man who had been silent until now, shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Grayson, is this true? He asked. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She had no defense. The proof was right there. She turned on them, eyes blazing. You're all just going to let him do this after everything we've worked for? Her voice cracked, her desperation showing. I stepped forward, folding my arms. What exactly have you worked for, Mrs. Grayson? I asked. To control this neighborhood? To decide who belongs and who doesn't? Because the way I see it, you've been abusing your power for years. And now? I smirked. Now? You're just another rule breaker who finally got caught. She looked around, searching for support. But the room had turned on her. One by one, neighbors spoke up. She fined me for a flower bed, someone said. She tried to evict the Johnsons over a porch decoration, another voice added. It was a domino effect. Everything she had kept hidden was coming crashing down, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She had lost, and she knew it. Mrs. Grayson pushed back from the table so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. This is bullshit, she spat, her voice high-pitched and raw. Sweat beaded on her forehead. The once untouchable HOA queen now looked like a cornered animal. This meeting is adjourned, she snapped, but nobody moved. A lawyer, a man from the HOA's own legal team, stood up, adjusting his tie. Actually, Mrs. Grayson, he said, voice measured but firm, given the evidence presented here today, the board will need to conduct a formal review of your conduct. The panic in her eyes was priceless. What? No, I run this HOA, she shrieked. He shook his head. Not anymore. He glanced around the room. All in favor of removing Mrs. Grayson from her position, effective immediately? Hands shot up. One, then another, then almost every damn person in the room. My grin widened. Looks like your rule is over, sweetheart. She let out a choked noise, looking around in disbelief. She turned to the remaining board members, eyes wild. You, not the community. Mrs. Grayson's hands shook as she looked around, realizing she had no allies left. And then, just like that, it was over. As she grabbed her bag and stormed out, the room stayed dead silent. And then? Applause. Not for me, not for some personal victory, but for justice finally catching up to the right person. And I made damn sure to savor every second of it.